Have you ever asked a model to code something for you, maybe just with a few lines you typed in? Or perhaps you even spoke in a whole slew of paragraphs like we've been advising, and sometimes you get something back that works pretty well, and other times not nearly pretty well? What is that all about? And better yet, is there any way to make it more pretty well and less, no thank you? Most important to this whole conversation is what you send into the model. Your prompt is the model's world. It's been trained to do nothing but serve that request. And so, seen through that lens, it's not really surprising to think if you don't send in enough information, it's going to make things up. Or if you send in way too much information, it's trying to service all of the parts of that request and it gets confused. Well, we're going to fix that in today's video by teaching you just a little bit on how to kind of change what you're saying to the model using a PRD. It's just a simple format, basically, on how you send your request in and what you send in. And it really will change the output you get from these models. Those models will really start to conform what you're asking for. So let's dive in and take a look at PRDs. Okay, as just a little bit of background, I thought I would start here with kind of traditionally, what is a PRD? Product Requirements Document. You don't have to know these terms necessarily, but PRD these days is gaining so much traction that if you remember those letters as kind of the definition document on how to send in requirements to an AI, you'll probably be better off because you can pretty much go to ChatGPT today and say, here's what I want to build, give me a PRD, and I guarantee you it'll be better. The PRD that it creates just from what you've asked for will be better than if you just asked for what you were asking for. It's a little circuitous, but you get my point. So the PRD is not a how-to. It's not a how document at all. It's the what document. So it's really the guidelines. It's the story of the goal, the rules, and the boundaries that you might find, not what technologies you might use or what structures there are inside of it. Now, this will pivot a little bit when we go forward and talk about what edits we have to do to this document to work with AI. But really, traditionally, you get a group of people together. Something like a product manager would come into the room and say, okay, here's what I'm interested in building. I want it to do this and that. And I asked for a very sample one here for something like an application called Quick Notes, lightweight note-taking application designed for users who want to quickly jot down text notes. All right, here's the scope. It's kind of the size, how big we want it to be, kind of the shape that we want it to stop at so that it doesn't creep too far. The goals and objectives are literally, these are the things we want to be able to meet with this application, at least this definition of it. Some assumptions we have. Here's some harder requirements that we're saying at the very least. These are the kinds of things that we do know the system will need to be able to do. We're not going to tell you how to do them, but a user needs to be able to create a note, edit a note, delete a note, view notes, search notes. Okay, so all of this sounds really, really plain so far, right? But this is actually when you bring the experts into the room to start having this discussion, where the discussion really starts. Everybody starts saying, okay, well, when you talk about searching notes, do you want to search with some heuristics? Is this a semantic search? What kind of mechanism do we need? Are there performance requirements behind that search? Or how many notes might we have? What are our technical requirements around those kinds of things? Where do you need them stored? Is it local only? All of that starts to build kind of technical documentation from an engineer standpoint. That's what we build from. We get that definition from kind of interviewing during this phase, basically. But really, even if you don't have an interview during this phase, as a technical expert, you would be expected to be able to answer some of those questions with best practices or best guesses or other things, kind of prior art in your area. So we build it this way because there's a lot of other systems in our environment that are built this way. But okay, so that's where this diverges a little bit. And I'll stop here. I'll scroll down and say, you can see it also shows a few things. One of the non-functional requirements, as well as what might be out of scope. And that's an important one to put kind of a guardrail on things to say, don't go too far. We're not asking you to build all of that. We'll think about that later. That does persist in the future document. But when we talk about having the experts in the room that can kind of reason with intuition about this and their institutional knowledge or something like that, this is where the big divergence comes. So if we give this kind of document to AI, it will struggle just as much as if we're giving it just the paragraphical text of what we want. And that's the distinction. Let's look into why we have to give basically a new kind of PRD to AI, is what I'm calling the AI PRD. It's a little bit different than the one that you would give to an engineer. Okay, so talking to an AI is obviously very different than talking to a person, but why that's the case is not entirely obvious. A lot of us start to believe that these AIs can pick up on anything and can intuit whatever they need from basically the internet of knowledge. But in reality, that's definitely not the case. It's worth understanding everything you say to an AI, and this is every AI. This today doesn't have anything to do only with coding. It has to do with ChatGPT, other places that you communicate with AI, the requests that you put in. The request that you're giving to that AI is the most important thing in the world to that AI. It knows the information that it has trained on, so let's just say the internet for this case, and what you've asked. And it's going to use those two pieces of information and nothing else. It has no other training to say, let me ask more questions, or do I really know enough to answer this question? Or what do they mean by this? Even reasoning models really are not doing that very well. They're not really interrogating the intent first. If you ask a question or something of an AI, it is going to do its best. This is in its training policy. Do its best to answer the question. We want you to give us an answer. And that's where hallucinations and other things come from, that it's just trying its hardest to give an answer. If you don't give it enough context, or if it doesn't have enough information, it's going to give you an answer. So that's what's happening in this case. I'm going to take this example here, where it was one of those requirements we saw before, which was creating a note. Seems really obvious. I'm giving this to a human engineer versus an AI engineer. There's going to be a very big difference of their take up of this. So it's going to say users can click on new note button to create a blank note. Okay, I have a concept that notes start blank now, and that there's a button that has new note on it. That's easy enough. Each note has a title and a body. Okay, I'm assuming those are the attributes. So those are the actual fields maybe that are part of the note object. Maybe this has just become kind of a structure for me. Does it have no other fields? Maybe that's the only fields that it can have. It doesn't say that, but I'll start from the idea that that's all we've got. I don't know what empty note looks like. Blank note. Is it a window? Is it part of an application? I haven't been told anything. So an engineer at this point immediately is going to start asking questions. If this is all they were given, they're going to say, no, don't have enough to build. I have no idea what you mean. Like, what system does this go into? Can they only click it? Are there other ways to kick off this new note? If I know that it's in a web system, is it a new page? Is it part of the page? You'll get all those questions, the obvious questions, and AI is not asking those questions. And that should be your hint as to why it's different, what you need to tell the AI versus what you need to tell an engineer. The way we used to transmit our information, like a PRD, is no longer valid. We have to do just a little bit more, and it's not a ton more. But it really is kind of a pivot on what we expect to see in that first requirements document. And I know I'm going a lot into the technical aspect of what's inside of these documents, but this is actually the fundamental information. And again, forget that I'm talking about coding. Just think AI. When you ask AI a question, all it knows is what you've told it. If you said to AI, a cold AI, you go to Meta and you say, how old am I? How is it going to answer that question? Now, let's not go into how it might actually answer that question, but you get my point. Basically, the context that we always talk about is super important here. Sometimes you can't give it a complete context. If I have a full-blown application somewhere and I just want to add a new button to it, I can't slurp in the whole application and say, fully understand this application so that you can change this button. That's maybe too much. So what I need to be able to say is, you find yourself in this section of a page. This page does these things. What I need you to concern yourself with is adding a button in here similar to buttons that you find somewhere else, etc., etc. Right? You're going to give it enough context so that it knows where to look. A human engineer is already going to do that intuitively. They either know the prior art, or they know who to call to find out what the prior art is, or they know how to do research. That is not what these AIs are doing. And that's really, frankly, the entire distinction. So from this, let's go take a look at how we might move from a traditional PRD to this new AI PRD. What's needed? What's different? Okay, before we jump into seeing these PRDs in action, let's talk a little bit about what's inside of them. I think this is probably the most important part of everything we're talking about here. I think you've heard most of it. First, want to reiterate, it is the fundamental. So I'm not teaching anything here that's specific to coding. This is very fundamental, which is just to say everything you're learning here will work going forward for a long time in almost all environments, all contexts. Understanding what AI understands or thinks about the input you're giving it really makes all the difference. You'll hear things like context engineering. That's really what we're talking about, is how do we give the right amount of information so that we know that it will stay within the guidelines we're setting for it and be able to be as creative as we want. So if we look here where it says the the AI PRD and what's kind of new here is we're trying to give it more context. What we just talked about, stronger guardrails, basically stay within the bounds, and then smaller scopes. We'll talk about that one after we get through this section and show you some of the builds that we have here. Smaller scopes are really important. It just basically means don't feed it literally everything that you can think of in one go. It's much more likely to get confused and wander off the rails to some degree in that regard. So let's move into this and take a very brief look at what might it look like. The objective of the whole thing is telling it what you want. This is the why we're trying to achieve, what we're looking to achieve here, and what this system does. The next one is what inputs you might have, what outputs it might have, what are the behaviors and rules, and what are some examples. And AI deals extremely well with examples, so if you have examples, include them. That really will make a difference. But I wanted to call out something here, which is this is not about creating a complete list of everything you want. At that first PRD phase, when you're trying to get the basic structure running and most of the features built out, you don't need to say, but when I hover it, I actually want the green border to go brown, so it kind of animates in a circular fashion, and I want the border radius to change from 0.5 to 0.7. That is not for this document. You're giving way too much detail way too early if that's what's happening. And if you just remove that level of detail from the things you're asking for and ask in phases and say, hey, phase one, I'm going to ask about basic application, the basic system I'm building, you will already be far more successful. All right, and the last thing that I wanted to mention is that there are edge cases that you want to mention if there are some. So this PRD, this AI PRD that we're building is really about describing the things that are important for the model to know about while it's building it. If it needs to control for certain things, you are not allowed to call this API more than once a minute. That goes into the PRD. Feels like a technical detail, but when you're building like this with an AI system, it won't ask that follow-up question. So you need to say, oh, be careful. You can only call this once a minute. Or all of your calls need to return in less than 200 milliseconds. It will not make that intuition itself, so don't expect it to. That's what belongs here. The other one is any evaluations, so some way that it might be able to judge itself if it hit the mark. That's actually kind of important. And then boundaries, kind of you can do this and this, but also feel free in this space to explore. I don't really have a good idea for the tile. Feel free to kind of play a little bit and be creative. So those things actually work within the model. Keeping it on task and telling it specifically what you need, not all of your thoughts of maybe it does this or maybe it does that or maybe it does this, and you'll get much better results. Now let's use this. Let's see this in action. I have two examples over here. Okay, so the first one is just a raw input. So this is me saying out loud into a microphone, this is what I'm interested in creating. A slick single file match 3 game, grid of gems where you swap to adjacent pieces. We all know a slide puzzle that you can move things around and they match gems, that kind of stuff. Bombs, rainbow fields, column, row clearers, those kind of things. Bigger matchers, more satisfying effects. There you go. So this was this single request that I put in and I had ChatGPT build it. So everything we're seeing here is really a single pass, ChatGPT just taking this and building it. And what we end up with is a game that does actually work. It does have a countdown timer. That's one of the requirements. I have to select 2 things. It's worth noting you can't slide things, even though that's mentioned. So I have to select 2 gems and things will cascade in clearing as you'd expect. See if I can get another cascade here. No. Oh, there we go. Excellent. So it works, right? It's maybe less pleasing than we'd want, but it certainly hits the mark of being a gem game that you can clear things. Although I will note once it goes to time 0, it doesn't have any end game or any other thing that you might expect. So I would say the information that we gave this prompt as we were talking about had no information about what to do at the end or that there was a beginning or an end or a restart or anything else. So it did not intuit any of that. You can't expect it to always make these details up. If those are details you're interested in, as we know, those are the details that go into that PRD. So let's look at turning this into a PRD and building from a PRD. Now, to be fair, let's take a look at how I did that. Okay, so this is where I started. I was speaking this in. What I represented last time as what I spoke isn't quite right, but I spoke it in here saying, here's what I'm looking to build, and it's basically the stuff I described. And I said, I want you to give me 2 things back. I want you to give me a raw version that's spoken text that I can read out loud. That's what we just went through. But I also then want to create a PRD for it. I don't need it to be technical. I don't need it to be simplified. I need it to be a kind of an AI PRD that we've been discussing, where we give enough definition around things that we want to occur and a definition around other things that we don't want to occur, who just leave enough space surface area for the LLM to build and create. My speech to text is a little faulty these days. Okay, so basically what you're saying is this is the spoken text that I was representing, but it also gave me this PRD. And I've just copied this PRD, and it's a pretty good one, frankly. It does have quite a bit of all of the things that we've been talking about. Success criteria is included, open space for creativity, just like we were talking about. Okay, so let's go see this being built. Okay, and for the big one, so that we took that little prompt that we'd put in and turned it into a PRD, this big, huge PRD, I just dropped it in here and said, please build this. And it built this document, of course, which is rather enormous. Not the way to do this stuff. But if we run this, we now have something that looks a little bit more like this, complete with sound effects that you won't necessarily be able to hear, but it is kind of a completed version of the application. I think it's really actually pretty good. It's kind of fun to play. It's kind of addictive. Sorry. So this is actually how we get from a simple prompt to a PRD. And I really didn't do much other than make sure that what was in that PRD is what I wanted. I didn't have to edit it this time. I kind of just left it to see what it could come up with, but it did a great job. And it was much easier for the model to be able to come up with this kind of a solution versus making all of those decisions, getting lost, and just giving me a very simple output. In any case, this is the actual difference using a PRD and not using a PRD. So at the very least, take your prompt, put it into ChatGPT and say, give me a PRD, and then go build with that. That's the minimum step. Okay. Final step, and this is kind of brand new, my own invention here. What you're seeing here is kind of a definition of what you might have in a PRD. And really, when you look at it, it's pretty thick. At this point, we have a lot of moving concerns here. We have authentication messed up with database modeling and database work and API layers. Individually, if those two things were together, that might work. Also collapsed with all of the front end issues and the searching and the testing and polish and all of the different things you might put into an application. I think most people, most architects would look at this and say, this is too big of a bite to take on for any one document, much less any one effort. So taking this on as a single effort doesn't make a lot of sense. So my idea here, and this is not new, I'm not really inventing the world here, I'm just introducing another document. The best way to make these performant is to be able to stop at certain points and take a look at them, evaluate them, make sure you're on track. This is normal operating procedure for development. So I'm advocating that what we do is we break these down into phases and then have a coordinating document. And let me describe that for just a second. So basically, these phase documents look very similar to the AI PRDs that we've just been learning about and putting together, except they're a little bit smaller. Not surprisingly, right? They deal with a little bit less information each, and that way you might be able to put information or tests or some kind of controls around it. So maybe it's just a human in the loop check at the end of building this phase 1 PRD for the base structure. Let me go and touch things and make sure it works. And then I move on to the next PRD. Now, what's inside of this PRD is fine. Just building phase 1, not so hard. Building phase 2 gets a little bit tricky, and let me describe this to you. Phase 2 doesn't know phase 1's been built. That's where this little trick comes in, and that's what we're talking about with this meta PRD over here. So the meta PRD is just an orchestration or a kind of memory document that sits over there holding the information that all of them need. For example, what might be in this document? Information that phase 1, we're going to build these things. Phase 2, we're going to be building these things. Phase 3, we're going to be building these things. The reason that might become important is when you're building phase 2 and have no reference of what's in the phase 3 document, we don't want this guy reaching into this guy's work and saying, oh, well, let me put some testing around this, or let me figure out how I'm going to deploy it. And we want him to be opinionated in a way that he can look back and know, oh, somebody's already worked through user authentication. I'm not supposed to do that. There will be instructions in this meta PRD that say, on your phase, stay in your phase. Do not reach into other phases' information, but you should be aware of what they need. Also in those instructions would be something like, if you need stubs for those phases' information, for example, phase 1 really may need a screen to test it out to make sure it's okay. This instruction would say, if you need to build a stub and put a comment in saying this is a stub version of this page, not to be used for production. And then the next phase, when we're building it in phase 2, it'll notice that and take it out. You can also have another instruction that says, go clean up any that are stubs. Feel free to remove them as needed. By the way, when you're building phase 2, you're sending the meta PRD. You're sending this file along every time you send the others along. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go take a quick look at what a meta PRD might look like just from a structure standpoint, so you can kind of take a look and know, okay, if I have a big project, that might be a way to do it. Okay. Last step here is just to show you very briefly this Meta AI PRD. I've created it with an application that I'm building, and I wanted to show you just what it looks like in action. Breaking things down into their tiny, tiny component parts is not always the best way to work. I don't want to tell you you should be doing this Meta AI PRD kind of thing. If you have any takeaway from this video, understand PRD. PRD doesn't even matter as much as be more explicit, tell everything you need to tell to the AI, of course. But if you have a relatively complex problem that in a single kind of build, it's probably going to go off the rails, then you definitely want to build in parts. You may already be doing this. You may say, I'm going to go build the architecture first, check it out, and then go build the pages. That's fine. What this is doing is allowing you to do that all at once and keep a governing information or some kind of overarching memory in this Meta PRD. So let's look very briefly at it. The purpose of the application is up here, kind of the why. These are the explicit phases themselves. And this is what I was talking about, that when you're on phase 3, it will know phase 4 is doing something. And we'll take a look at that. In fact, we're going to look at phase 2. So let's go take a look at the second. This is the PRD2. This is the second phase. So the first phase is ostensibly has already been delivered. We send these two documents and say build, and it tells what the purpose of this phase is about, what we are building, what are the in-scope things to build in this phase, and the things you should not build in this phase, just as meaningful. Then there's some placeholders that you might either need to pay attention to or create or remove. The user flow definition of the actual structure itself, what the deliverables are. You can see there's this handoff contract. So I just wanted to show you that this thing is building out this way. It really actually works quite well. It's absolutely not perfect. So how have I shared this with you so that you can go to see it? In the description, you'll see the links to all of these things. I have created a custom GPT. If you happen to have an OpenAI account, you'll be able to log in and use this thing. The button down here is a sample, is design a sample to-do app. An example of that would be here. So we can take a look at the to-do app being defined, and we're seeing this as the Meta PRD, the overarching one that we're used to. And you can see they broke it into 5 phases and a whole bunch of different rules. And here's the first PRD, etc., as you can tell. The other way that I'm sharing this is through GitHub itself. So I've created a doc repo for you to be able to come out here and just grab it. Here's the document. You might want to just download the document itself. If you go into it, you can just download the file, and that way you can drag it around and use it as you see fit, or of course, play with it, delete it, remove parts of it, define it again, throw it into ChatGPT and say, make this better, make it shorter. But at least it's a good start of saying, how do I create something that's much larger? If you have a PRD already or a request that you've used previously, try running it through this GPT or just use this document, which is all the GPT, the custom GPT does. So I just wanted to share this with you. It's been working for me, but moreover, I just wanted to say breaking things down absolutely helps on something big. Don't ignore that. Even if you're doing it yourself, you don't have to use something fancy like this that probably will break more often than the way you're going to do it by yourself. So don't think this is the secret sauce. All right, I think that's it. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Okay, so that's kind of a whirlwind idea of putting PRDs together and what's important. And really, once again, as I've said many times probably already, it's really about context. It's about how much you put in. Don't put too much in. Don't put too little in. And of course, that's so subjective that I can't really guide you on something like that. You'll start gaining an awareness of it. But if your builds are smaller, phasing it or something like that, then if it does go off the rails, you'll know your PRD wasn't quite there, adjust it, try it again, and you won't have lost so much time that you waited for 45 minutes to get to the end and it doesn't do anything that you want it to do. So I think that Meta PRD concept has some legs to it, but again, that's really for much bigger projects or when you really have a reasonable way to phase it. Any request that you're putting in, especially for building, will benefit from having this kind of PRD concept around it. So I hope this helped a little bit. Subscribe if you like this kind of content, because it seems recently this is really a lot of the content kind of stuff that I've been leaning into, and I have a couple more really big ones like what the heck's going on with GPT-5? I really am finding it to be really good in some places and very middling in other places. So I kind of want to do something on that, a little investigation. In any case, thanks for coming along for the ride on this one, and I'll see you in the next one.